The 24th of December, 1944. A remote farmstead near Hearne, Texas. The wind cut across the flat plains, carrying a scent so rich and heavy, it felt like a physical blow to the stomach. It was the smell of hot grease, pepper, and rendering animal fat, a violent contrast to the stale aroma of boiled cabbage that clung to the women's wool uniforms. Inside the wire perimeter, Ilse stood rigid, her breath hitching in the freezing air. She shifted her weight to shield young Greta, who was trembling not from the cold, but from the sight of the man approaching the fence. He was a giant of a man, silhouetted against the roaring bonfire and the long tables laden with food. He wore a battered Stetson and a sheepskin coat that made him look more bare than human. In his right hand, he gripped a long, serrated carving knife, the steel glinting orange in the firelight. He marched straight for the wire, his boots crunching heavily on the frost-hardened mud. "Don't look at the knife," Ilse whispered in German, her voice barely audible. "Eyes down. Do not provoke him." The man stopped inches from the fence. The smell of fried chicken was overwhelming now, drifting from the cast-iron skillets behind him. He raised the knife, pointing it not at their throats, but toward the open gate. His voice was a gravelly growl that promised violence, but delivered something else entirely. "You ladies deaf?" he barked, gesturing with the blade toward the steaming platters. "I said, get over here. It ain't gonna eat itself." If you enjoy stories where humanity bridges the divide of war, please consider subscribing and let me know in the comments which country you are reading from. 6 weeks earlier, Camp Hearne, Texas. The transport truck hit another pothole, sending a violent shudder through the wooden benches and jarring the spines of the 20 women sitting inside. Ilse von Weber did not flinch. She sat near the tailgate, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The canvas flap at the rear of the truck was tied open, framing a retreating view of a world that felt increasingly alien. For the last hour, the scenery had dissolved from the ordered barracks of the main POW camp into an endless, monotonous expanse of brown scrub brush and red dust. Texas was too big, Ilse thought. It was a landscape that swallowed sound and distance, making a person feel insignificant. Unlike the dense forests of her home in Bavaria, there was nowhere here to hide. "Are we lost, Oberschwester?" Greta whispered from across the aisle. The young girl, barely 20, was twisting the hem of her gray skirt until her knuckles were white. They said the branch camp was only 30 minutes away. "Americans are terrible at geography," Ilse lied smoothly, her voice steady. "Sit up straight, Greta. Do not let them see you slouch." Ilse was not an officer, but as the senior nurse captured during the retreat in Italy, she was the anchor the others clung to. She smoothed the fabric of her uniform, worn but meticulously clean. She checked her pocket for the 3rd time, reassuring herself that her Red Cross identification card was still there. It was her shield, her only proof that she was a protected person under the Geneva Convention, not a criminal. The truck began to slow, gears grinding with a metallic screech that set Ilse's teeth on edge. They turned off the paved road, onto a gravel track. Through the dust kicked up by the tires, Ilse saw their destination. It was not a prison in the traditional sense. There were no stone walls or guard towers looming high above. Instead, it was a cluster of weathered wooden buildings, a large barn, a bunkhouse with a tin roof, and a smaller farmhouse in the distance, all surrounded by a single, hastily erected perimeter of barbed wire. The truck lurched to a halt. "Everybody out. Rouse, move it." An American sergeant banged on the side of the truck with his baton. Ilse descended first, helping the others down. The air here was different, drier, carrying the scent of dry grass and manure. As the women formed a line, blinking in the harsh midday sun, a man detached himself from the shadow of the barn. He was not a soldier. He wore denim trousers stained with earth and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms thick with muscle. A wide-brimmed hat cast his eyes in shadow. and on his hip, hanging from a leather belt, was not a pistol, but a heavy, sheathed knife. This was the foreman, the cowboy the rumors had warned them about. He walked slowly down the line of women, his boots kicking up small puffs of red dust. He didn't look at their faces. He looked at their hands, assessing their strength like one would assess livestock at a market. He stopped in front of Ilse. "I'm Tate," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in his chest. He didn't shout, which somehow made him more intimidating than the guards who screamed. "I don't care about your war. I got 50 acres of cotton and corn that needs pulling before the freeze. You work, you eat, you make trouble. Axe." His hand drifted, almost unconsciously, to the hilt of the knife on his belt. He didn't draw it. He didn't have to. The threat was in the casual weight of his hand, resting on the leather handle. "We are protected under the Geneva Convention," Ilse said, her English heavily accented, but clear. She stood taller, meeting his shadowed gaze. "We are medical personnel and non-combatants. We are not slave labor." Tate paused. He tipped his head back slightly, revealing eyes that were hard and unimpressed. He looked at the barbed wire fence that separated the bunkhouse from the open fields, then back at her. "Convention don't pick cotton, lady," Tate said, turning his back on her. "Sun's up. Grab a sack." Ilse watched him walk away. The wind picked up, rattling the loose tin on the bunkhouse roof and whistling through the barbs of the wire fence. It was a lonely, sharp sound. She looked at the knife swinging at his hip, then at the terrified faces of her girls. "Pick up the sacks," Ilse ordered quietly in German. "We show them who we are by how we work, not by how we fear." She bent down and picked up a canvas sack. It smelled of raw cotton and old sweat. As she straightened up, she saw Tate watching them from the porch of the farmhouse, sharpening that knife against a whetstone. Shh, k, shh, k. The sound carried clearly across the yard, a rhythmic promise of the sharp edge that defined their new world. The Texas sun was not merely hot. It was a heavy, physical weight that pressed down on the back of the neck, relentless and inescapable. By noon, the romantic notion of the American West that Ilse had once read about in Karl May novels had dissolved into a gritty reality of sweat, blistered palms, and the endless rhythm of the chop. They were tasked with clearing the remnants of the harvest, breaking up the hard-packed earth between the rows where dried corn stalks rattled like bones in the wind. It was men's work, heavy and dull, but Tate had made it clear that there were no men available. The war had taken them all. Ilse swung her hoe with practiced efficiency. She did not look up. She focused entirely on the patch of dirt in front of her boots, regulating her breathing to match the strike of the iron blade. Inhale, lift. Exhale, strike. It was a way to survive, a way to turn the mind off and let the body become a machine. But she could hear the others faltering. Specifically, she could hear Greta. The young nurse was sobbing quietly, a jagged, wet sound that carried across the dry field. Ilse risked a glance. Greta's hands were raw, the wooden handle of her hoe slick with blood from burst blisters. She was striking the ground weakly, her form collapsing under the exhaustion. "Pace yourself, Greta," Ilse whispered, not breaking her own rhythm. "Do not stop. If you stop, you cannot start again." "I can't," Greta gasped, swaying. "It's too hard. The ground is like stone." "Work," Ilse hissed. A shadow fell over them. It was long and distorted, stretching across the furrows. The rhythmic thud of hooves announced him before Ilse saw him. Tate. He was patrolling the perimeter on a large bay horse, sitting high in the saddle, a silhouette of authority against the blinding sky. He wasn't shouting like the guards in the transit camps. He just watched. That silence was worse than screaming. It allowed the women's imaginations to fill in the blanks with their worst fears. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the field. Ilse froze. Beside her, Greta stood staring at her hands. The handle of her hoe had snapped cleanly in two, the metal head buried deep in a stubborn knot of roots. The girl went pale, her eyes widening in absolute terror. In the camps back in Europe, destroying equipment was sabotage. Sabotage was punishable by beatings, or worse. The horse's hooves stopped. The creak of leather saddlebags was the only sound in the sudden, suffocating silence of the field. "Do not move," Ilse commanded under her breath. She dropped her own tool and stepped in front of Greta, shielding the girl with her body. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin to face the rider. She had seen what happened to soldiers who broke equipment on the Eastern Front. She braced her muscles, expecting the sting of a riding crop or the butt of a rifle. Tate nudged his horse forward. The beast was enormous, snorting hot air that smelled of hay and dust. Tate looked down at the two women. His face was unreadable beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes hidden in shadow. He chewed slowly on a toothpick, his gaze drifting from Ilse's defiant face to the trembling girl behind her, and finally to the broken handle on the ground. He reached behind him. Ilse stopped breathing. She watched his hand move toward the saddlebag, near where the rope and the rifle were tied. "Here it comes," she thought. "The punishment." Tate's hand emerged. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a spare hoe handle, smooth hickory wood that glowed honey-colored in the sun. He didn't throw it. He let it drop. It landed with a dull thud in the dirt at Ilse's feet. "Wood gets dry out here," Tate said. His voice was flat, devoid of anger. "Brittle. Happens all the time." He looked Ilse directly in the eye. For a second, she thought she saw something flicker in his expression, not pity, but perhaps a flicker of recognition. He saw her fear, and he found it boring. "Fix it," he ordered. "Then get back to work. Day's only half over." He turned the horse and trotted away, not looking back to see if they obeyed. Ilse stared at the hickory handle lying in the dust. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had expected violence. She had prepared herself for cruelty. She did not know how to process this indifference. "He didn't hit us," Greta whispered, sinking to her knees, her hands shaking so hard she couldn't grasp the broken tool. "Oberschwester. He didn't hit us." Ilse picked up the new handle. It was warm from the sun. "No," she said slowly, watching the cowboy ride toward the horizon. "He didn't." She knelt down to help Greta wedge the new wood into the iron head. It was a confusing mercy, cold and practical, but it was the first crack in the wall of terror she had built around herself. The only shade to be found was beneath the overhang of the equipment shed, a narrow strip of darkness that smelled of diesel and dry rot. The women huddled there during their 30-minute lunch break, eating sandwiches made of white bread and thick slices of processed meat that tasted of salt and preservatives. It was soft food, lacking texture, so different from the dark rye bread they dreamt of. But it was not the food that choked them, it was the sound. 10 yards away, a young guard sat on an overturned crate, nursing a bottle of lukewarm Coca-Cola. Beside him sat a portable radio, its leather case battered and stained. The device buzzed with static before clearing into the confident, mid-Atlantic clip of a news announcer. The voice was cheerful, almost musical, as it listed cities that were burning. "Third Army continues its push toward the Saar," the voice crackled. "Heavy resistance reported near Metz, but General Patton is confident." Ilse stopped chewing. She stared at the radio as if it were a venomous snake. The names of the towns were familiar places, where she had cousins, where she had attended school. Hearing them pronounced with that flat American optimism felt like a physical violation. "Make him turn it off," whispered a nurse named Helga, covering her ears. "Eat," Ilse commanded, though her own throat felt tight. "The radio is not for us. Ignore it." Then came the mail call. The guard stood up, turning the volume down slightly, but not off. He pulled a small bundle of envelopes from his satchel. They were standard prisoner of war stationery, flimsy paper that felt as thin as onion skin. He tossed the bundle toward Ilse. It landed in the dust, near her boots. The women descended on the pile with a desperation that stripped away their dignity. Hands trembled as they sorted through the names. Ilse took hers a letter from her sister in Munich and held it against her chest, not yet daring to look. A wail pierced the heavy afternoon heat. It was Greta again. The girl was holding a sheet of paper up to the sunlight. It looked less like a letter and more like a target. Thick, heavy strokes of black censor ink obliterated entire paragraphs. Only scattered prepositions and articles survived. "They crossed it all out," Greta gasped, her eyes wide and unseeing. "Why? Why would they cross it out, unless it was bad? Unless the house is gone? Unless Mother is dead?" "Greta, stop," Ilse said, moving toward her. "They are dead," Greta screamed, the hysteria rising in her voice. She crumpled the paper in her fist. "Everyone is dead, and we are stuck here picking cotton for the people killing them." The guard looked up, his hand drifting toward his baton. The tension in the shed spiked. Panic was contagious. Ilse could see it spreading to the other women, their eyes darting from Greta to the guard, their breathing shallow. Ilse snatched the letter from Greta's hand. The movement was sharp, almost violent. "Enough!" Ilse snapped. The command cracked like a whip. "This ink means nothing. It means an officer didn't like the weather report. It means someone wrote about food prices. It does not mean death." She smoothed the crumpled paper against her knee. The black bars of ink glistened in the sun, opaque and final. Ilse knew Greta was likely right. The censors rarely wasted ink on trivialities. But truth was a luxury they could not afford. "You are a soldier of the Reich," Ilse lied, her voice dropping to a cold steel whisper. "You do not weep in front of them. Do you understand? You do not give them the satisfaction." Greta sniffed, wiping her nose on her sleeve, shamed into silence. She nodded, her shoulders slumping. Ilse folded the letter and tucked it into her own pocket. The whistle blew. The break was over. As the women shuffled back toward the blinding brightness of the fields, Ilse lingered for a second in the shade. She looked at the guard, then at the radio. The announcer was now talking about a baseball game. The transition from war to sport seamless and jarring. Ilse touched the pocket where she had hidden Greta's letter, and behind it, her own unopened envelope. She felt the sharp corners of the paper through the fabric. She was terrified to open her own. What if hers was also just black ink? What if there was nothing left of Munich but silence? She turned her back on the radio and walked into the sun. The physical pain of the work was better than this. At least the cotton didn't speak. The wind had shifted. For weeks, it had blown from the north, carrying only the sterile dust of the plains and the smell of dry grass. But 3 days before Christmas, the air currents turned, rolling in from the south, directly from the main farmhouse kitchen toward the prisoner barracks. It was a psychological assault that no artillery barrage could replicate. Ilse stood by the wire fence, ostensibly checking the drying laundry, but her attention was fixed on the white clapboard house across the yard. Smoke was rising from the chimney in a thick, lazy column. It did not smell of coal or pine wood. It smelled of rendering fat, of onions sweating in butter, and of spices that were aggressive and foreign. Back in the mess hall, the POWs ate what the Geneva Convention dictated. Adequate calories, balanced nutrition. But it was a gray, boil, in the bag existence. It was fuel, not food. What wafted across the yard now was something else entirely. It was the scent of excess. Is that paprika? Helga asked, standing beside Ilse. She had stopped pinning a shirt to the line, her nose twitching like a rabbit's. And vinegar? Are they making sauerbraten? No, Ilse said, her mouth watering painfully against her will. It is peppers. Chili peppers. And garlic. It is American food. The abundance of the farm was its own form of propaganda. Every morning, trucks arrived, loaded with crates that seemed to groan under their own weight. Sacks of flour, baskets of winter squash, sides of beef wrapped in white butcher paper. In Germany, before they were captured, Ilse remembered rationing cards that offered grams of margarine and ersatz coffee made from chicory. Here, the Americans treated food with a casual disregard that was almost offensive. A delivery truck rattled past them on the gravel road, heading for the farmhouse delivery entrance. It hit a rut. The same deep rut that never seemed to get fixed. The vehicle bounced violently. From the back, a single russet potato, large and covered in field dirt, tumbled off the tailgate. It bounced twice and rolled to a stop in the dead grass, just a few feet from where the prisoners were working. It was a trivial object. A dirty, root vegetable. But in the context of their hunger, it shone like gold bullion. Ilse saw the shift in the line. It was subtle, a tightening of shoulders, a collective intake of breath. Several of the younger women stopped working. Their eyes locked onto the potato. It was outside the fence, but close enough. If one were quick, if one reached through the strands of wire, don't, Ilse whispered. But hunger has no ears. A girl named Clara, who had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg, took a step forward. She looked left, then right. The guards were bored, looking the other way. Tate was nowhere to be seen. Clara dropped to her knees, pretending to tie her shoe, her hand inching toward the wire, toward the prize. Ilse moved. She didn't run. Running attracted attention. She walked with a terrifying, swift purpose. She reached Clara just as the girl's fingers were curling around the bottom wire to pull it up. Ilse kicked the dirt. Her boot struck the ground hard, sending a spray of gravel through the fence, burying the potato and startling Clara back. Get up, Ilse hissed, grabbing Clara by the collar of her coat and hauling her to her feet. It's just a potato, Clara pleaded, her voice cracking, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. They have thousands. They won't miss one. You are not a rat, Ilse said, gripping the girl's arm tight enough to bruise. You are not a scavenger. If you take that, you tell them that we are starving animals who will crawl in the dirt for their garbage. But I am hungry. Clara sobbed, softly. We are all hungry, Ilse replied, her voice hard but her eyes softening as she looked at the girl's gaunt face. But hunger is temporary. Shame is forever. Look at them. She gestured with her chin toward the farmhouse porch. Two farmhands were unloading the truck, laughing, tossing sacks of sugar to each other like toys. They hadn't even noticed the lost potato. Their indifference was the point. They want us to beg, Ilse said. They want us to break. We will not break for a root vegetable. She steered Clara back toward the laundry line. Ilse looked back once at the potato, now half buried in the dust. Her stomach cramped, a violent protest against her pride. She hated the Americans for their endless trucks. She hated them for the smell of onions and garlic that clung to the air, reminding her with every breath that she was a guest in the land of plenty, while her own home was likely burning to the ground. Texas weather was a liar. It had seduced them with weeks of mild, golden sunshine, only to turn vicious overnight. The locals called it a blue norther, a fast-moving cold front that swept down across the plains, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees in the span of an hour. By dusk, the water in the outdoor troughs had skimmed over with ice, and the wind was howling through the gaps in the bunkhouse walls like a dying animal. Inside, the single potbelly stove was fighting a losing battle. The women huddled together in their cots, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. But the standard-issue army wool blankets were too thin. They were designed for barracks, not for a drafty wooden shack in the middle of a prairie blizzard. Ilse watched Greta shivering uncontrollably, her lips turning a faint shade of blue. The coughing had started an hour ago. A dry, hacking sound that echoed ominously in the dark. Ilse knew the sound. Pneumonia killed faster than bullets in conditions like this. She made a decision. She stood up, wrapping her gray coat tight around her, and marched to the door. "Where are you going?" Helga asked, her teeth chattering. "To get what we are owed," Ilse said grimly. Crossing the yard was a physical struggle. The wind bit at her exposed skin, stinging her cheeks. The farmhouse looked warm and impenetrable, yellow light spilling from its windows onto the frozen mud. Ilse stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She refused to climb up. She would not give them the excuse to shoot her for trespassing. "Mr. Tate," she shouted over the wind. "Herr Tate." Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, the heavy oak door creaked open. Tate appeared, framed by the warmth of the hallway. He was holding a mug of coffee, steam rising from it in thick curls. He looked down at her, squinting against the cold. "You're supposed to be inside, lady," he rumbled. "Curfew." "We are freezing," Ilse said, her voice steady despite the shivering of her body. "The temperature has dropped. We have sick women. Article 25 of the Convention requires quarters to be fully protected from dampness and adequate heat. We need blankets. Wool blankets." Tate took a sip of his coffee. He looked at the thermometer, nailed to the porch post, then back at Ilse. He didn't seem angry, just weary. "Don't have any," he said flatly. "Supply truck don't come till Tuesday. War effort took all the spares." "Then we will freeze," Ilse stated, locking eyes with him. "And when the inspector comes, I will show him the bodies." Tate sighed. He set his mug down on the railing and rubbed the back of his neck. "Wait. Here." He disappeared, not back into the house, but down the steps and around the side, toward the barn. Ilse waited, hugging herself, hope rising faintly in her chest. Perhaps he had hidden supplies. Perhaps there was a human heart beneath that rough exterior. Tate returned 5 minutes later, carrying a massive bundle over his shoulder. It was not wool. It was burlap. They were feed sacks, rough, brown, scratchy Hessian bags stamped with the logo of a grain company. They smelled of oats, molasses, and horse sweat. "Best I got," Tate said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Empty feed sacks. Stitch 'em together, layer 'em up. They hold heat better than you think. Kept me warm on the range, many a night." Ilse stared at the pile of dirty sacks. Her face flushed hot, the heat of humiliation overriding the cold. Back in Germany, she had been a head nurse. She had worn starched white linens. She was an educated woman. And this cowboy was offering her garbage used for livestock. "You treat us like animals," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "We are soldiers. We are not your horses." Tate looked at her, his expression hardening. "I treat you like folks who are cold. You want 'em or not?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked back up the stairs, picking up his coffee. The door slammed shut, extinguishing the light and leaving Ilse alone in the howling wind with the pile of sacks. She stood there for a minute, tears of impotent fury freezing on her lashes. She wanted to kick the sacks. She wanted to leave them there, to rot in the snow. But then she heard the wind scream again, and she thought of Greta's blue lips. Slowly, painfully, Ilse bent down. She gathered the rough, smelly bundles into her arms. The burlap scratched her wrists, abrasive and crude. Back in the bunkhouse, there was no triumph in her return. The women looked at the sacks with the same horror Ilse had felt. But, Survival has no pride. Get the sewing kits, Ilse ordered, throwing the sacks onto the floor. And the heavy needles. For the rest of the night, the only sound was the wind outside and the pop hiss of needles being forced through thick hemp. They sewed the feed bags into crude quilts, stuffing them with old newspapers and straw. When they finally covered themselves, the sacks were heavy and scratched their skin. But Tate was right. They were warm. Ilse lay in the dark, the smell of horse feed filling her nose. It was the smell of the barn, of the beast. She pulled the scratchy cover up to her chin, hating the warmth, hating the man who gave it, and hating herself for being grateful for it. December 24th dawned with a sky so blue it looked like painted porcelain, brittle and flawless. But there was no peace in the clarity of the morning. The farm was alive with a chaotic, joyful industry that felt like a deliberate insult to the silent, gray rows of the prisoner barracks. The preparations for the feast were not hidden indoors. In the Texas tradition, the cooking was an event to be performed in the open air. Just 20 yards from the barbed wire, 2 large oil drums had been cut in half to serve as grills. Beside them, massive cast-iron cauldrons sat on tripod stands, waiting for the fire. Ilse sat on the steps of the bunkhouse, her sewing kit open on her lap. She was trying to reattach a button to Greta's coat, but her fingers were stiff with cold, and her eyes kept betraying her. Every time she looked up, she saw the abundance. It was obscene. A farm truck had backed up to the porch, and men were unloading crates with a casual disregard for the treasures they held. Ilse saw the pale, goose-fleshed skin of plucked chickens, dozens of them, piled high like cordwood. She saw a side of beef, wrapped in muslin, being carried by 2 men, who laughed as they struggled with the weight. "Look at the size of them," Helga whispered. She was sitting next to Ilse, ostensibly darning a sock, but her needle had not moved in minutes. "I haven't seen a chicken that fat since 1939. "Focus on your work, Helga," Ilse murmured, though her own stomach gave a treacherous cramp. "Envy will not fill your belly." The worst part was not the sight, but the sound. It was a rhythmic, metallic rasp that cut through the crisp morning air. Tate was standing by the long trestle tables they had set up on the lawn. He was not wearing his usual work gloves. His hands were bare, and in them, he held a long butcher's knife and a whetstone. He drew the blade across the stone with slow, deliberate strokes. He wasn't looking at the knife. He was looking at the fire pit his men were building, checking the stack of hickory wood. To Ilse, the sound was primal. It was the sound of violence. In the field hospitals on the Eastern Front, she had heard surgeons sharpening scalpels with that same detached precision before amputations. It was a sound that promised blood. "He looks like an executioner," Greta said, her voice trembling. She was watching Tate test the edge of the blade against his thumb. "He is a cook today, nothing more," Ilse said firmly, snapping the thread with her teeth. But she felt the fear radiating off the girl. It wasn't just the knives. It was the crates of brown bottles being stacked near the fire. Beer. And the clear jars of moonshine that the younger farmhands were passing around even at this early hour. Alcohol made men unpredictable. Drunk men with knives, celebrating a holiday of peace while guarding the enemy. It was a volatile mixture. Ilse remembered the stories the propaganda officers had told them about American soldiers. Gangsters, undisciplined, prone to wild rages. "Listen to me." Ilse addressed the group, her voice low and commanding. "Tonight, when the sun goes down, no one goes outside. We lock the door from the inside. We do not look out the windows. We do not let them see us." "But it is Christmas Eve," Clara protested weakly. "We could sing." "We will sing quietly," Ilse cut her off. "We will not provoke them. They will be drinking. They will be celebrating their victory. We will not remind them that we are here." As if to punctuate her order, a loud cheer went up from the farmhouse. One of the cowboys had successfully lit the fire under the cauldrons. Flames licked up the sides of the black iron. Then came the sound of oil being poured, gallons of it, glugging thick and heavy into the pots. Within minutes, the air began to change. The clean scent of winter was replaced by the heavy, heating aroma of lard. It wasn't cooking yet. It was the smell of potential. The oil was warming up, getting ready to receive the flour-dredged birds. Tate wiped the knife on his apron and stabbed it into the wooden table. It stood there, quivering slightly, the steel gleaming in the winter sun. He turned and said something to his men, and a roar of laughter followed. They looked happy. They looked like men without a care in the world. Ilse looked down at the button in her hand. It was a cheap plastic disc, chipped on one side. This was her reality. That world over there, the fire, the food. The laughter was as distant as the moon. "Turn your chairs," Ilse ordered suddenly. "Face the wall. We will finish the mending before lunch." Reluctantly, the women shifted their seats, turning their backs on the feast. But they couldn't turn off their noses. The oil was getting hot. The torture was just beginning. Night fell over the Texas plains like a heavy woolen blanket, extinguishing the blue porcelain sky and replacing it with a vast, suffocating darkness. Inside the prisoner barracks, the only light came from a single kerosene lantern that Ilse had placed on an overturned crate in the center of the room. Around this fragile circle of light, the 20 women sat on the floor, their legs tucked beneath them for warmth. They had combed their hair and straightened their uniforms. It was Christmas Eve. And despite the burlap sacks on their beds and the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, they were determined to be German women of faith. "We will sing," Ilse announced softly. Her voice was the only thing holding the room together. Just the first verse, softly. For us, not for them. She clasped her hands together. The others followed suit, closing their eyes to shut out the drafty walls of the shack. Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The harmony was thin and wavering, but it was pure. For a moment, the familiar cadence of the hymn transported them back to snow-covered villages in Bavaria and bustling streets in Berlin. For a moment, they were not prisoners of war. They were simply souls waiting for a miracle. But the miracle that arrived was not spiritual. It was culinary. The wind gusted, rattling the loose window frames, and with it came the smell. It had been building all afternoon. But now, with the frying in full swing, it was a tangible presence. It was thick, greasy, and overwhelmingly savory. It was the smell of chicken skin bubbling in hot lard, seasoned with black pepper and salt. It was the smoky, sweet tang of molasses-based barbecue sauce caramelizing over open coals. The smell didn't just enter the room. It invaded it. It sat heavy on their tongues, coating their throats. Alles schläft, einsam wacht. Clara's voice cracked and died away. Then Helga stopped singing. One by one, the voices dropped out of the chorus. Silenced not by an order, but by the violent biological imperative of hunger. Ilse kept singing alone for 2 more measures, her eyes squeezed shut, trying to force the holy words past the wall of saliva flooding her mouth. She could taste the phantom crunch of fried batter. Her stomach gave a loud, traitorous growl that echoed in the sudden silence of the room. She opened her eyes. No one was praying. Every head was turned toward the door. The small gaps between the wooden planks of the wall were glowing orange from the bonfire outside. Laughter drifted in loud, boisterous American laughter mixed with the twang of a fiddle playing a fast, upbeat reel. "They are eating now," Greta whispered. Her voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion except longing. "Can you hear the plates? I can hear the forks hitting the china." "Do not think about it," Ilse commanded. But her voice lacked its usual steel. She was dizzy with it. The sensory input was too much. The contrast between the cold, dark deprivation inside and the warm, greasy, noisy abundance outside was driving them mad. "It smells like heaven," a young nurse named Maria murmured, tears streaming down her face. Why do they torture us? Is it not enough that we are locked up? Must they cook the bird under our noses? Ilse stood up. She needed to block the gaps in the wall. She needed to hang a blanket over the door. She grabbed one of the burlap sacks Tate had given them. We will sleep now, Ilse said desperately. Everyone into your bunks. Cover your heads. But Greta didn't move toward her bunk. She stood up, her movements slow and dreamlike, as if she were walking underwater. Her eyes were fixed on the door handle. Greta, Ilse warned, stepping forward. Sit down. I just want to see, Greta said. Just one look. Maybe they left something. Maybe a bone fell. Greta, no? The girl was moving faster now, drawn by a magnetic force she couldn't resist. She reached the door before Ilse could intercept her. The metal latch clicked a sound, loud as a gunshot in the quiet room. The door swung open. The world outside rushed in. The orange light of the bonfire flooded the entryway, blindingly bright. The heat of the fire clashed with the freezing air. And the smell, God, the smell hit them with the force of a physical blow, a tidal wave of fried chicken and wood smoke that made Ilse's knees buckle. Greta stepped out onto the porch, into the forbidden zone. Greta! Ilse screamed, forgetting the rule about silence, forgetting the fear of the guards. She lunged after the girl, grabbing the back of her coat just as Greta reached the top step. But it was too late. They were outside. They were visible. Across the yard, the fiddle music stopped abruptly. The laughter died. 20 heads turned toward the barracks porch. Ilse froze, her hand gripping Greta's collar. In the firelight, she saw them. The cowboys, the farmhands, the foremen. They were frozen mid-bite, chicken legs in their hands, grease on their chins. And standing closest to the fence, knife in hand, was Tate. He stared right at them. The silence that descended on the farmyard was absolute, heavier than the winter air. Moments ago, there had been the scratch of a fiddle and the raucous noise of 20 men celebrating. Now, the only sound was the crackle of the bonfire and the wind whistling through the barbs of the perimeter fence. Ilse stood on the porch, her fingers dug deep into the wool of Greta's coat, anchoring the girl to the spot. She wanted to drag her back inside, to slam the door and bolt it, but her legs refused to move. They were trapped in the cone of light spilling from the open doorway, exposed like actors on a stage who had forgotten their lines. Across the yard, the tableau of men shifted. The smiles dropped from their faces. They set their beer bottles down on the long tables. They were big men, broadened by hard labor and heavy coats, and in the flickering firelight, their shadows stretched out across the frost-hardened ground, like giants. Inside, Ilse hissed, tugging at Greta. Now, but Greta was paralyzed. Her eyes were wide, fixed not on the men, but on the golden piles of fried chicken stacked on the platters behind them. She was starving, and the fear center of her brain had been overridden by the primal demand for calories. They see us, Greta whispered, her voice trembling. One man separated himself from the group near the fire. It was Tate. He looked even larger than Ilse remembered. He wore his sheepskin coat, the collar turned up against the wind, making him resemble a bear standing on its hind legs. The firelight caught the brim of his Stetson, hiding his eyes in two pools of darkness. But the light found something else. In his right hand, gripped tight, was the long carving knife. He stepped over the low bench and began to walk toward the fence. He didn't hurry. His boots crunched heavily on the frozen mud. A slow, rhythmic thud, thud, thud that matched the pounding of Ilse's heart. He is coming, Ilse breathed. The stories of the American gangsters flooded her mind. Stories of drunk soldiers taking what they wanted. Of laws that vanished once the sun went down. They were defenseless women. Enemy combatants. Unprotected by anything but a thin wire fence, and a piece of paper signed in Geneva that seemed very far away right now. "Eyes down," Ilse commanded, stepping in front of Greta to shield her. She assumed the posture of submission she had learned in the defeat. Shoulders hunched, head bowed, making herself small. "Don't stare at him. Don't look at the knife. Do not provoke him." Tate reached the perimeter. He stopped inches from the wire. He was close enough that Ilse could smell him a mix of wood smoke, whiskey, and the iron scent of the blade. She could hear his breathing, heavy and shallow in the cold. Ilse squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the shout, for the accusation of espionage, or for the sound of the gate being kicked open. She braced herself for the violence. "You ladies deaf?" The voice was a low growl, vibrating with an aggression that made Ilse flinch. She opened her eyes, looking at his boots, afraid to look up. Tate raised the knife. He pointed the serrated tip not at them, but toward the open gate, a few yards to the left. He gestured sharply toward the fire, toward the tables groaning under the weight of the feast. "I said, get over here." Tate barked, his tone rough, impatient, like a man scolding a slow-witted dog. "It ain't gonna eat itself, and if I have to eat another drumstick by myself, I'm gonna explode." Ilse blinked. The words didn't make sense. She stared at him, her brain struggling to translate the intent behind the aggression. He wasn't ordering them to their knees. He was ordering them to dinner. Tate scowled at her hesitation. He looked back at his men, then back at Ilse, his expression softening just a fraction, not into a smile, but into something resigned. "Well?" he demanded, waving the knife again, this time more like a conductor's baton. "Open the damn gate. That chicken is getting cold, and my boys don't know how to sew a button on to save their lives. We got a trade to make." The tension in the air didn't vanish. It shattered. The terrifying silhouette of the executioner dissolved, revealing just a tired, weather-beaten farmer who had cooked too much food and had no one to share it with but the enemy. Ilse felt Greta's hand slip into hers. The girl's grip was crushing. "Did he?" Greta stammered. "Did he just invite us?" "No," Ilse said, her voice shaking, as she finally looked up into Tate's shadowed eyes. She saw no malice there, only a rough, unspoken truce. "He didn't invite us. He ordered us." She took a step toward the gate. Crossing the threshold of the open gate felt more dangerous to Ilse than crossing a minefield. The physical distance was only a few meters, but the psychological chasm was vast. Behind her, the squad of 19 women moved in a tight phalanx, their footsteps shuffling on the gravel, their breathing synchronized in anxiety. As they approached the firelight, the American men stepped back. It was a clumsy, unrehearsed retreat. These rough-handed farmhands, who could wrangle steers and mend fences, suddenly looked terrified of the small, gray uniformed women entering their circle. They wiped their hands on their jeans, pulled off their hats, and stared at their boots, unsure of the protocol for feeding the enemy. Tate stood by the head of the table, acting as the bridge between the two worlds. He didn't smile. He simply pointed at the stack of tin plates with the tip of his knife. "Grab a plate," he grunted. "Don't be shy. There's more corn in the pot, and enough bird to feed the whole Third Army." Ilse was the first to reach the table. Her hands were trembling, not from cold anymore, but from the sheer sensory overload. Up close, the food was staggering. The fried chicken was piled in mountains, the crust, golden brown and jagged, glistening with hot oil. Beside it were deep bowls of collard greens stewed with ham hocks, trays of yellow cornbread, and pots of mashed potatoes that steamed in the night air. She picked up a tin plate. It felt heavy and real. She reached for the tongs, hesitated, and then clamped them onto a large drumstick. The heat radiating from the meat warmed her palm through the thin metal of the plate. She turned to nod at her girls, giving them silent permission. "It is safe," her eyes said. "Eat." The women descended on the table. There was no scrambling, No chaos. Their German discipline held even in the face of starvation. But there was a desperate, focused intensity to their movements. Ilse stepped away from the crush, finding a spot near the warmth of the bonfire. She lifted the drumstick to her lips. The first bite was a revelation. It was loud. The crust shattered with a distinct crunch that seemed to echo in her ears, followed immediately by the rush of hot, salty grease and tender meat. It was not refined food. It was aggressive, bold, and deeply comforting. It tasted of black pepper and paprika, of patience and calories. Ilse closed her eyes. For a fleeting second, the war dissolved. There was no barbed wire, no Wehrmacht, no allies. There was only the primal satisfaction of fat and salt. An involuntary sound escaped her throat, a small, soft moan of pleasure that she couldn't suppress. When she opened her eyes, she realized she wasn't the only one. The yard was filled with the sounds of eating, the clinking of forks, the tearing of bread, the satisfied sighs of women who had forgotten what it meant to be full. The tension in the yard began to unspool. The cowboys, seeing the women eat with such appreciation, seemed to relax. The awkward silence was replaced by the universal language of hospitality. "Try the hot sauce, ma'am," a young farmhand with red hair stammered, pushing a bottle toward Greta. It clears the sinuses." Greta, her mouth full of cornbread, nodded enthusiastically, her eyes wet with tears that had nothing to do with the spice. Ilse felt a presence beside her. She turned to see Tate. He wasn't eating. He was leaning against a fence post, whittling a piece of wood with a small pocket knife, watching the scene with a detached curiosity. He reached into a metal cooler filled with ice and pulled out a glass bottle. The curve of the glass was iconic, known even in Europe before the darkness fell. Coca-Cola. He popped the cap off on the edge of the cooler and held the bottle out to Ilse. "Sugar water," Tate said, his voice low. "Good for the digestion." Ilse stared at the bottle. It was cold, sweating condensation in the firelight. It was a luxury item, a symbol of the American empire, of the soft power that had swept across the globe. She took it. Her fingers brushed against his rough, calloused hand, a momentary contact between enemy and captor. "Thank you, Mr. Tate," she said, the fizz of the soda biting pleasantly at her tongue. "Don't thank me," Tate replied, looking out at the women devouring the feast. "Just couldn't stand the quiet. A man can't enjoy his dinner when the neighbors are staring." He took a sip from his own bottle, then gestured with it toward the starry sky. "Besides," he added, "it's Christmas. Even cowboys got rules." Ilse took another bite of the chicken. The grease coated her lips, and for the first time in years, the knot of fear in her chest loosened. They were still prisoners. The wire was still there. But tonight, under the vast Texas sky, the hatred had been drowned in gravy. The sun rose over the Texas panhandle with a brilliance that stung the eyes, bleaching the color from the winter grass and turning the frost on the barbed wire into strings of diamonds. It was Christmas Day, but strictly speaking, it was a workday. The war did not observe holidays, and neither did the cotton harvest. Ilse woke before the whistle. For the first time in months, she did not wake with the hollow, cramping ache of hunger in her gut. The sensation was strange, almost disorienting. She lay still on her cot, feeling the heaviness of the previous night's meal settle in her bones like a warm anchor. The grease, the salt, the sugar from the Coca-Cola, it was fuel that burned slower and hotter than the watery cabbage soup they were used to. She sat up and touched the rough fabric of her blanket. The burlap feed sacks, stitched together with desperate, clumsy threads, still smelled of oats and horse sweat. 2 days ago, Ilse had looked at them and seen only an insult, a confirmation that to the Americans, they were nothing more than livestock. Now, she ran her hand over the coarse weave and felt something different. She felt the pragmatism of a man who had given them what he had, not what he thought they deserved. "Time," Ilsa whispered, clapping her hands softly to rouse the others. "Up, smooth your uniforms. We go out with dignity." The women moved slower this morning, but there was no fear in their eyes. The terror that had defined their arrival, the fear of the gangster soldiers, the fear of the knife had evaporated along with the steam from the kettles. When they stepped out into the yard, the evidence of the feast was gone. The tables had been scrubbed and folded. The blackened oil drums had been hauled away. The ground where the bonfire had roared was just a circle of gray ash, already scattering in the wind. It was as if the truce had been a dream, erased by the efficiency of the morning chores. They marched toward the gate, their boots crunching on the gravel. The guards were there, rifles slung over their shoulders. But as the women passed, the young guard with the red hair, the one who had offered the hot sauce, didn't shout at them to keep in line. He simply looked down at his boots and tipped the brim of his helmet slightly. It wasn't a salute, but it was an acknowledgement. They were no longer faceless enemies. They were the people he had passed the cornbread to. The work in the fields was the same as it had always been. The wind was still cold, and the cotton bolls were still sharp, cutting into their fingertips. But the silence that hung over the rows was no longer heavy with tension. It was a companionable silence. At midday, the water truck arrived. Usually, the driver would leave the bucket by the fence and drive off, forcing them to scramble for it. Today, he waited. He watched as they drank, his elbow resting on the open window frame, a cigarette burning idly in his hand. He didn't say anything, and neither did they, but the hostility was gone. Ilsa finished her ladle of water and wiped her mouth. She looked toward the farmhouse. Tate was there. He was standing on the porch, leaning against the railing in that same bear-like slouch, watching the work crews. He wasn't wearing his sheepskin coat today. The sun was warm enough for just a flannel shirt. The knife was gone from his belt. Ilsa hesitated. The rules of non-fraternization were back in effect. To speak to him now would be to break the fragile illusion of order they had re-established. She straightened her back, adjusting the collar of her worn Wehrmacht uniform. She looked across the 100 yards of dry Texas earth and locked eyes with him. She didn't smile. He didn't smile. Tate simply raised his chin, a single, sharp nod. It was the gesture of a foreman to a worker, of a host to a guest, of a human to a human. Ilsa nodded back, a slow inclination of her head. She turned back to the field, picking up her sack. It was lighter now. Or perhaps she was just stronger. She knew the war was far from over. The radio would continue to bring news of burning cities, and the letters would continue to arrive covered in black ink. But as she reached for the next bowl of cotton, Ilsa realized that the American propaganda was wrong, and so was her own. The enemy was not a monster. The enemy was just a man who didn't like to eat alone on Christmas. And that simple, caloric truth was a soft power far more devastating than any bomb. Ilsa took a breath of the crisp air, smelling the dust and the faint, lingering ghost of hickory smoke, and began to work.